Yep. So that TV's the live TVs.
Mm-hmm.
All right, good afternoon. Today is Tuesday, September 14th, 4 p.m. This is the kickoff meeting for the Joint Airport Zoning Board for the New Ulm Municipal Airport. I'm Joe Stad. I'm City Engineer for the City of New Ulm. As we don't have a chair yet for this board, I'll run the meeting pro tem here until we have elections and go through that process. So welcome, board members. If we want to go around and just introduce ourselves quick. Wayne, if you want to start.
Wayne Clausen.
I'm Rosie Gear.
I'm Tony Berg.
Keith Marty.
All right, thank you, everybody. We have Brian Page with us from Mead & Hunt, our airport consultant engineer, and he'll run through most of the agenda here this afternoon. So I'll bring Brian up and let him get started.
All right. Thank you, Joe. As Joe had mentioned, I'm Brian Page. I'm with Mead & Hunt Consultants. We are the consultant for the City of New Ulm and have been the airport consultant for about the last 20 years or so, roughly. So, but we will be assisting the process going forward with this Joint Airport Zoning Board, talking a little bit about what needs to be done going forward and kind of lay out the ground rules and so forth. As Joe has mentioned, one of the first steps that does need to take place is you do need to elect a chairperson, whoever that's going to be, that kind of manage the overall process going forward. That election would take place consistent with the city code of 3.19, which in essence is appointed through an election of this group. So you would determine, I guess, who that person is going to be going forward. So, and I think Joe might have some suggestions of different people that, might be somebody for you to consider. So, but to talk a little bit about the Joint Airport Zoning Board, I think all of you have been appointed to the positions that you're in some cases invited by the city to be able to participate in this overall process. And in essence, what it is a statutory requirement for all public service airports in the state of Minnesota to go through this process. And there is a state template or a model that's out there that you can follow that makes life a lot easier for you, or you could choose as a community to go through what they call a custom zoning approach. There are nuances and differences, I guess, between the two. But I think for practical purposes, we'll focus on following the commissioner's standards and a standard approach for what's going to take place at the airport here in New Ulm. So essentially, the purpose of it is to protect the airspace around the airport for not only the flying public, but then also the people on the ground as well, just to prevent any sort of inconsistent or non-compliant uses of the property around the airport and non-conforming, type development from happening in and around the airport environment in general. So tonight, what I wanted to do is just kind of keep it more on a broad overview level because the chairperson isn't with us currently. So a lot of this, I'd like to kind of keep until that person is appointed and on board so that person can be part of our overall process. But really today is to really kind of answer any questions that you might have about going forward. I'm going to outline the process moving forward and what needs to take place in order to be able to follow the process that is needing to take place over the next several months. So with that, we went through some of the introductions and so forth. I put together a little bit of an agenda to kind of spell out the overall process. Talked a little bit about the city code. The city code that's out there is in section 3.19 that talks about how this board is established. In essence, it's going to be two chosen by the city council, 2 members by Brown County, and then those members would determine who the overall chairperson is going to be. The term is for 2 years. One of the reasons it is for 2 years is this body is really pulled together to establish this zoning update. Once the update is in place, then it's turned over to some other governing bodies, such as a zoning administrator, and then also a board of adjustment. We'll talk a little bit about that, get a little bit into the weeds when the time is right about what those bodies are and what their purposes serve in this overall process. The Zona Requirements, again, this is a statutory requirement that's found in Chapter 360 of the Minnesota statutes. So if you're so inclined to want to take a look at that, feel free to go ahead. The template that I was mentioning earlier is actually found in the Administrative Rules, Chapter 8800, which deals with aeronautics around airports. And the overall process is more or less there and supported by the Minnesota Department of Transportation, who we will be communicating with, and this decision and the overall zoning update that we're going to be coming up with is actually presented to the Minnesota Department of Transportation for their final approval. So, talk a little bit about the existing ordinance. There is an existing ordinance for the airport in New Ulm, but that ordinance dates back to, it looks like it was originally ratified in 1983, but then it looks like the following year there were some revisions made to it, and it was finally adopted by the city in 1984. Not much is done, has been done to it since. So that's one of the reasons why we're getting together now to update it, because there are quite a few changes that have taken place since 1984. So it is high time to get through this. Now, again, this isn't anything different. Most airports around the state are kind of in a similar boat going through this. What's really kind of spurring the new updates is there was a regulatory change that actually happened that was passed by the legislature in 2019. So that's part of the reason that this is happening now, and one of the drivers behind getting it updated at all airports in the state of Minnesota. Some things to note of the 1984 zoning is it did zone for a 5,500-foot primary runway. Not in its current configuration. The runway has shifted somewhat, but it is 5,500 feet. The other thing is there wasn't any sort of zoning parameters put together for the crosswind runway back in 1984. So that's something that we're going to be doing for the first time. This talks a little bit about the various different zones associated with the airport. You have basically 3 zones that we're going to be establishing around the airport. Zone A is going to be the most restrictive, and essentially that's going to be 2/3 of the runway length off the end of the runway. And essentially, the requirements of that zone are going to be that there will be no structures of any kind in that Zone A. Then it goes to Zone B. Zone B does allow some structures, and there is a ratio of the number of people per acre. And in essence, they want all of the different properties that are in that Zone B to be at least the size of 3 acres or more. For a variety of different reasons. And then once you get to Zone C does allow structures into it, and essentially what that is it's the dome around the airport. We have a graphic that we'll kind of talk about here in a minute, and I'll kind of show you what that looks like. The overall standard zoning process is what's up here now. It is the number of processes that you see there, about a 10-step process. Starting with going through and establishing this joint board. Once the board has been established, then what we'll do is we'll go into the mode of drafting up that ordinance and working together to be able to arrive at that. The next step will be to take what comes out of the decision of this group, send that off to MnDOT for their review, and once we get their review comments back, we'll address the comments. The next step is to schedule the first public hearing. Once we have the first public hearing of that overall proposed ordinance, once we take into any sort of comments that come back from the general public, then the next step will be is that ordinance will be taken and sent and compiled and sent into the commissioner for their review and approval. So once that takes place, then the next step will be is a second public hearing. Once the second public hearing is cleared, then if there's nothing to address out of that second public hearing, the next steps will be is to adopt the ordinance. Sounds kind of neat in a nutshell, but it does take time. We'll talk a little bit about that in the timeline in the end. But if you're so inclined, the regulatory changes with the Commissioner Standard, we'll get into the weeds on this a little bit during the subsequent meetings that we'll be having in the months ahead. This talks a little bit, this is directly from the state statutes, and everything that we're doing is going to be following and in compliance with statutory requirements. This drawing is going to be kind of hard to see. We'll have some better drawings that get a little bit more blown up and a little bit more visible as to what these areas represent. But if you can see on your screen, essentially the zones that I was talking about earlier, we'll just take the primary runway for example. If you see these yellow trapezoids that are off the end of the runway, the first trapezoid that's closest in to the end of the runway, that is Zone A. The second zone that you see out there that starts from Zone A out, that is Zone B. And then this huge dashed line that goes all the way around the entire airspace of the airport, that is Zone C. So just to kind of put it in perspective and on a map is you can kind of see the magnitude of what we're doing here. This shows the overall project schedule. Now again, the schedule is a little bit, it kind of ebbs and flows a little bit depending on our timing, if the group can't get together, whatever the case may be. But for the most part, you're probably looking at roughly about anywhere from probably an 8 to 9 month process to unfold. Not that we're going to be working diligently for that period of time, but there are some public meetings and there's some notices and stuff like that that we need to factor in. So if we look at it today and looking at the timeline, here we are starting in September of 2021 with establishment of the joint board, establishment of the chair. Hopefully that takes place here in the month of September yet. Then establish the zoning parameters and so forth. Moving into the zoning ordinance and maps starting next month in October. It's probably going to take roughly about 60 days plus or minus to be able to come up with all the maps and the ordinance and the draft and all of that good stuff. So we're probably pushing toward the end of the calendar year to have that completed. Once we do, then the next step will be is to submit that first draft off to MnDOT, have them review and comment. They were pretty good. The last one that we did, we do a lot of these coincidentally throughout the state. The last one that we turned in, they turned back to us in about 30 days. So, which was great. That was wonderful. So if that happens, the next step would be is to schedule that first public hearing. That public hearing will be showing in about February of next year. Once that meeting takes place, then the next step would be is to send this off for Commissioner's order of approval. And once that goes into the Commissioner's order of approval, they have up to 90 days to review and respond. That hasn't been going as quickly. That's been taking a little bit more time. So my guess would be is we're probably looking at 60 to 90 days plus or minus to be able to get that back. So if that is indeed the case, we'd be looking at having that second public hearing in June of next year, and then with the adoption and filing of the ordinance sometime around this time next year, maybe June or July or August in a perfect world. So we'll see how that goes. So with that, as far as next steps and what we would be looking at doing is again, probably the primary thing right now would be to establish who the chairperson is going to be, get that person involved. We'd have a similar meeting to this, maybe a little bit more of a deeper dive into some of the jargon, the definitions, things like that of what we're trying to do. We'll have the existing ordinance on hand so we can actually use that as a reference document and actually take a hard look at the things that actually need to change. So with that, then we'll move forward into that process. We'll go back, come up with that draft. We will draft that for you, for the city, for your review. This body will take a look at it, make adjustments as needed, and then once we all agree that that is how the new ordinance is going to look, the next step would be is to get that first MnDOT review. So with that, that's about it. That's kind of giving a broad overview of the overall process. So with that, I just kind of wanted to open up to any questions anybody might have.
Thank you, Brian. Board members, for your reference, I can email you the link for the existing ordinance. It is on the city website under the airport page for your review. It's not the most exciting reading, but it is out there. So I can email that link out to you if you would like to read at your leisure. I guess, Brian, at this time, if it's all right, I'll jump into what the city's suggestion would be for the chairperson. From a city standpoint, our thought process here was to assign somebody or to present somebody as our option for the chair that would also serve as that zoning administrator. The department that takes care of all of our zoning-related issues for the city is our Community Development Department, and the director of that department is Dave Schnelbreck. Dave has extensive background in airport zoning and also served on the Airport Zoning Board of Adjustment previously and served as that chair, so I feel he would be a good fit for this position. And then as being appointed as a zoning administrator as well, our thoughts process is that with any zoning issues that come before the city, him or his office is already taking care of that. So that would be our suggestion for the chairperson. But if the board has any other suggestions, it'd be certainly up to the board to discuss that and share your thoughts. So with that, any questions or for myself or for Brian at this time?
No questions here. Sounds like he's more qualified than anybody else I know.
Yeah, and I should
I was curious about the runway, how you said that there was a drift to it. I mean, is that, well, how was that said? That, was it, I mean, I'm thinking, we're talking about the paved runway, right?
Yeah.
And it's not exactly where it was? Is that what I understand there?
That is correct. And what we did is in, I think it was about 2009, 2010, there was a project out of the airport. And in essence, what that project involved is extending, widening, and then shifting the runway to the south.
I see.
And the reason for that is to be able to meet the aircraft demand. So what happened is with that, prior to that point, I think the runway was only at about 4,800 feet.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Prior to that, it wasn't the full.
It wasn't the full
But
5,500?
when they zoned for the runway back in 1984.
Thanks.
But when they zoned for the runway back in 1984, what they need to do is actually zone for what the plan for development is going to be for the runway. And believe it or not, in 1984, they were talking about a 5,500-foot runway then. So that's what this equivalent body did back in 1984, is zone for that ultimate condition. But the problem of it is after the runway was shifted, the zones and everything, the zones that I showed you on that one map, start at the end of the existing runway. So at that point in time, once it's shifted, that zoning is no longer really valid because that's not where the runway is anymore.
Okay.
So it's off by about 400 feet. So not that it's a huge deal, but at the same time, it's just another reason that we should go through and do it.
So the alignment is the same, you just took the whole
Alignment's
runway
the
and
same.
pushed it one direction?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And then there were some upgrades, if you were familiar at that time. There was the upgrades with the approach lighting system that was added on the south end of the runway. And again, the runway was widened at that time, and then a bunch of other navigational aids were also updated at that time.
Thank you.
So the map that's in front of us, it shows the existing zoning or how it should be with the new
That will
rules?
be the proposed zoning.
That's the proposed?
Yep.
Okay.
And this drawing is actually from what's called the airport layout plan. This is actually the land use planning map for the overall airport. So what this does is this shows all of the different land uses that are currently around the airport. And then the zones that you see with the trapezoids going off the end, this actually shows what that would look like if we zoned correctly according to the commissioner standards. So you'll note that the existing crosswind runway, we're not showing zoning on that runway. Reason being is in the future, and again, we'll talk about that, talk a little bit about the history of that runway, but it just isn't practical to be zoning for that runway because the runway will be decommissioned in the not too distant future. What we will be zoning for is a new, more east-west true alignment of a runway, and we'll have to zone for both ends of that runway as part of that.
Will that be a sod runway too then?
It'll be a sod runway. Yep. It's a lot to digest, I know, but if there are any, questions that come up, we're going to try to do in this overall process is look at meeting about maybe once every other month or so is kind of what we find is going to be the sweet spot. So you're probably looking at, roughly 3, maybe 4 meetings somewhere along the way. And those meetings are really to kind of get you updated, have you have an opportunity to ask those questions. Well, why are we needing to do this or that or whatever the case may be? So, it is a collaborative process, so we really enjoy all of your input. It's all very valuable, so it allows us to go back and really go to the drawing board to find out what needs to be done with these various different aspects of the zoning. So this work is already under a state grant. Just so you know, the work involving this zoning is already covered as part of a State of Minnesota Department of Transportation grant for the city of New Ulm.
All right, board members, any other questions at this time?
Is that crosswind runway, the new one, going to be same length as the existing, or is it going to be lengthened?
Was long,
It'll be a little bit
longer, yep.
That's a good thing.
By how much?
We're probably looking at about 600 feet more than what it currently is. One of the reasons for that is if you're familiar with the airport, if you're familiar with that runway, you'll note that the runway has been shortened a couple of different times. The actual pylons that are out there that indicate where the end of the turf runway is been moved back further away from Highland Avenue. So the published distance is actually a little bit longer than what it is actually out there in the field today as a result of that. So, but what we're going to do is the actual length is based on Federal Aviation Administration recommendations for the various different aircraft using that airport.
Will it still be on both sides of the main runway?
It will still be on both sides of the main runway. That's a requirement that the FAA is asking us to do. We actually had an alternative that showed it as being further west and not intersecting with the primary runway, but the FAA wouldn't allow that for safety reasons.
I mean, I realize we're talking about zoning here, but are there any plans to pave that runway, or is it going to stay a grass strip for the time being?
The paving of the runway could be a possibility down the road. It kind of depends on what the traffic would be and the traffic counts and the kind of aircraft that are using that runway. Right now, the idea would be is to replace it in kind with the turf. Reason being is soft field landings are somewhat desirable at certain airports, and that's what you have today.
Yeah.
So if you pave it, there's certain advantages, and then there's disadvantages. So that'd be something we could talk about. But for right now, there is no hard plan to actually pave it, although it does have that possibility that it could happen in the future.
Thank you.
So, back to the chair position, board members, if you're comfortable in electing tonight, again, my recommendation would be Mr. Schnellbrick. I guess if you have any thoughts on that, questions on that? But we haven't identified any other individuals. We talked to additional airport commission members, but none of them were interested. So we're falling back to Dave on our recommendation, as we didn't have any other commission members that were interested in being the chair.
Well, I was not aware that Dave was that familiar with airport zoning, but you're saying he is, so, I mean.
Yep, he's got the
He seems
experience
like a
in the past.
natural
Sure.
choice.
That was part of our thought process as well, is it seems like a good natural fit.
I have no problem having Dave being the chair. I don't know about anybody else here, but.
I don't know him, but
If he wasn't the chair, he'd still be available for consultation for questions either way, correct?
Right, yep. And one thing to keep in mind is the zoning administrator side of this as well. So after the board is decommissioned, we still need that zoning administrator that would take care of miscellaneous zoning issues that would occur in Zone A or B. We'll actually have an item for the board at a future meeting where there's a parcel where the lot line doesn't fall quite right, so it's in that Zone B area. So it's actually going to make a parcel that's less than that recommended 3 acres. So things like that would be something that zoning administrator could deal with without the board, because after 2 years, the board's going to be dissolved, but we still need that zoning administrator to address those issues that were to come up, so we don't need to convene a board for a simple zoning change or variance, things of that nature. And then as far as the zoning administrator portion of that, that would be, our thought was it would be the community development director or their successor, since if Mr. Schnellrick were to retire, then next in line would be able to address those zoning things as the zoning administrator.
I might just add for the good of the group as well, that this is something that Joe is kind of touching on here, that this is more or less kind of a living, breathing document that does need to be, basically brought out from time to time. Somebody needs to have the wherewithal to be able to enforce it as well. And time again, what the state finds in some cases is that's not always done real efficiently. So what you want to make sure is you've got somebody that is part of this process that's going to continue on after this board's duties are done. And once the zoning update and the new ordinance is in effect and ratified, somebody to be able to take that was part of that process going forward, that can now be, responsible for enforcing it. So it is a good idea to have a person, and as Joe and I talked about, it's not usually named as a named individual for obvious reasons, because this does carry on. Last one was in 1984. This one will probably go on for a decade or more, who knows? But so what would be advisable is to be able to determine who that zoning administrator is going to be by title, within an organization. So whoever would be that next zoning and planning director for the city would be that person, that zoning administrator, to be able to move things forward. Same thing with the Board of Adjustment. The Board of Adjustment, that's what we'll be talking about a little bit in the days ahead as well. So anyway, just kind of wanted to point that out, that it's your decision who you want to make that chair, but there are certain advantages to doing it with somebody that's, going to be kind of the keeper of the document going forward.
You'd need a nomination from the floor then is what,
Correct, Mr. Berg, yep,
Waiting on it.
yep. Yeah, so if, the other option is if you wanted to wait until the next meeting, but that would somewhat push our schedule back just a little bit, because we'd prefer to, if the board's comfortable with that, to appoint a chairperson today. So next meeting, we can really hit the ground running on the actual ordinance.
Is there a similar position at the county level as far as zoning?
The county's got their planning and zoning department as well, with Mr. Sleda, head of that department.
yeah.
Yep. The county just doesn't see airport zoning items before them, since they don't have a airport to deal with. So,
Right.
yep.
So if it's somebody other than Dave, as an example, then we would need to contact them to see if they're willing to serve. Is that the process, or
Yep, correct, yep.
how common is this for somebody other than with other airports that you deal with?
I would say the vast majority of municipal airports are going to go with somebody in the planning, department.
Okay.
Usually it's that planning director. Just the reason being is they have that background.
I understand
and they
that part
kind
of
of
it.
have a more comprehensive idea of what's happening, I guess, in the general community. But there certainly are instances all across the board. But the one nuance that I kind of wanted to make sure that we're clear on is this joint board that's assembled here is really comprised of all the jurisdictions that are going to be impacted. So your decision and your zoning that you're going to ultimately be coming up with is essentially part of this body, which is considered to include both Brown County and the city of New Ulm. So in the end, it's really not, that, okay, Brown County does this, New Ulm does that. It's, you're all one and the same. So the people that are administering this going forward and have the general oversight of the document are essentially going to be one and the same, because this body is more or less a cohesive body that came up with the zoning. Does that make sense? Now, who you determine who you want as the chair is your decisions, and that's, you as a body have to elect that person who you feel is the most qualified. So it's just that going forward, it is going to be something that that person will be responsible for making sure that this document and what it says, is being enforced.
I guess I'd have no problem with Mr. Schnobrick, so I will nominate him for zoning board chair.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Any other nominations? Any other nominations? Any other nominations?
No.
Right. I would take a motion to approve a unanimous ballot for Dave Schnellbrick.
So moved.
And a second? Motion carried. All right, elections are done. I think we are at the end of our agenda for the meeting, unless, Brian, do you have any other topics we need to touch on at the end here? Oops.
I don't think so. I'll bring some information to the next meeting. Certainly Joe knows how to get in touch with me, so if anybody does have any questions, I know we've had conversations with some of you already about this process, so it is something that we're here for, so by all means, I mean, we're here for you, working for you and kind of helping you steer through this process, if you would. So if there aren't any questions along the way, certainly feel free to reach out and let us know. But again, we'll probably be shooting for sometime in October. We'll look at schedules. You know, maybe we can discuss or maybe put out a doodle poll or something like that of what days work best for this group. If today, Tuesdays, you know, ahead of the council meeting, I know, but you have the airport commission meeting, which usually takes place,
Yeah,
you know.
we filled the airport commission time slot with this meeting since we didn't have any items for the commission.
So that would be one thing for us to consider. What works best, you know, for your time and schedule, busy schedules and so forth, and we'll make the time work. But again, if we had a meeting, I think in October to kind of set the ground rules, if you would, kind of nail down our parameters, make sure everybody's on board with everything, then I think the next meeting, I wouldn't really see us really needing to get together until probably sometime in December. At that point. And at that point, we would be bringing you a draft of things. We would have some maps to show, some blown up off the ends of the approaches of the runways and so forth, and kind of get a little bit more into the weeds, you know, if you would. So.
And I know we do have 2 farmers on the board, so I know we're getting pretty close to harvest season, so.
It's already in.
Impede as much as it normally would because it'll be earlier, but.
Okay. So is there a specific day or time? Does earlier afternoon or later in the evenings work better?
Just one question.
Yep.
I know we're looking at maps, but it may be beneficial, at least for myself, and maybe other people here too, if we could, you know, just physically look at some of the highlights when we're there. You know, it doesn't have to be every little detail, but
Yep.
the end of Zone A, for example, or Zone B,
Absolutely.
just, for me, I can read the map, I understand that, but just to get a physical presence or,
And I can send out some emails with the existing zoning maps and stuff like that too, just so.
right, but I mean, if you could physically just go to that point, you know, of,
Yep.
at the airport.
Yeah. At future meetings, we'll make sure to have paper copies of everything available as
Well,
well.
even we could go on our own if you just put
True.
GPS coordinate points there or something like that, and
True.
we can walk
If we have
right
those
to it.
references.
Yep,
So,
yep, certainly. Yeah, we'll make sure to accommodate that request
All
at
right.
future meetings, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, does 4 o'clock work for everybody, or would we rather go 5, 6, or?
I'm here all the time, so it doesn't matter.
Sounds good. So, well, yeah, once we get closer to that next meeting, maybe I'll do a doodle, see what works best. If we don't have an airport commission meeting on October, maybe we'll try to fill that slot as well with the JASB here, so.
and you're looking at second Tuesday?
That would, if we don't have, but if we have a commission meeting, that date
Right.
may not work unless we go right after the commission and do it at like 5 or something like that, so. You have to see what other commissions have the room. But in the meantime, you all have my email address, so if there's specific information you want, maps you want, I can do everything up from 11 by 17 print to a 24 by 36 out of our office. So if something of that size is something you desire, just please let me know and we can accommodate that.
Okay.
So.
Keith, you were talking about actually physically going to the site and looking at it.
Well, if we have those references, I can go out there and do that at that point too, that's fine.
I like that idea.
Yeah, we can make that happen. We'll talk to some of our group that's out there working on the construction right now. Maybe just set some stakes or something out there with a ribbon on it that you can kind of get a general reference, like where the end of Zone A would be, where Zone B would, you know, end off the end, and kind of go from there.
Yep.
But one of the things that, you know, I wanted to point out that we did, and again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds today until Dave's with us, but one of the things that we did on positioning that crosswind runway was we brought it in far enough that it wasn't going to have any impacts with that county road that kind of cuts
12.
County Road 12.
12. And, yeah, so we brought it in far enough, whereas the other concept, if you would, that I mentioned that we did show the FAA, showed that road is actually being curved out and go around the end of the approach. That was one of the other reasons they said, yeah, that's just not something that they would support. So anyway, we're back to kind of keeping everything in place, keeping that county road out there, and you know, just the other kind of little nuance, I guess, that, you know, this has been talked about and planned for many, many years, but one of the nuances is on that east-west running runway, what we were going to do is also keep that on the section line, on the property lines, rather than have it go like it does today, more or less at a skew across those properties. Because that doesn't do anybody any good, you know, as far as being able to use that land for acre. At least if it's a little bit on each side of that fence row, you're taking that back piece. And again, the thing to realize is it's not that farming has to end in that area. It can still exist. And it would probably be better that it's more symmetrical with how the field layouts are anyway. So it might be a better opportunity to kind of straighten things out there.
How much land, if there's any land acquisition, does Zone A have to be owned? Or
Zone A is not, it doesn't entirely have to be owned, but there is what's called a state clear zone. And again, these are some terms that we'll get into and get into the weeds on.
We're getting
The
ahead
state
of
clear
ourselves.
zone is something that they are going to ask you to, but it doesn't go out and isn't as encompassing as what Zone A is. So.
And B is just, easement's probably the wrong term, but it's just it just has restrictions. It remains the landowner's. B.
B. Zone B does have some restrictions to it, and what they want it to be is essentially everything that exists out here today. There are no Zone B issues where
Yeah.
in the current configuration with this runway, that's one of the other reasons that we were looking at relocating that turf runway.
'Cause there's problems
Because
in
if you
B.
get out to Zone B,
Yeah.
it's problematic once you get out here. There's a number of legacy businesses here that are located right next to the highway that are in Zone B.
Yep.
And are a conflict. So this is the time to do it. There's not much out there. It's the time that would allow the city to be able to have this zoning to be able to use to prevent any sort of incompatible land uses out there. Now, it's not to say that, again, the zoning administrator can make that judgment call that, say, for instance, somebody's come in and wants to put in some sort of subdivision, and we did talk about this, that they want to put in some sort of housing development or something here on the other side of Highland Avenue across from the high school. There is ways to make that compatible, I guess, as far as the zoning is concerned. But you have to do some smart development in that area. Zone A will be Zone A forever. I mean, you can't have any structures in that. But Zone B, there are ways that that could be made to be compatible, I guess, with the zoning ordinance.
So Zone B would be similar to the area of Milford Heights down here that are just outside of the city limits, where there are the 3-acre lots with single-family homes and things of that nature, so.
But right on the end of the runway, I can hear the complaints already.
Yeah, well, yeah. We get them now anyway.
Yeah, I know. I wish we weren't crossing the pavement with the grass, because if you haven't gotten airborne yet, that's one heck of a jump. You also, boom.
Yeah, that's a pretty good.
I wish we weren't crossing the pavement with the grass. I'm surprised the FAA, well, they have their own ideas.
Their world, we just have to live in it. With that, we could have more discussion, but I think I'll adjourn the meeting with no further business. But if there is further discussion, we can certainly have that. So, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.